Sophie the waitress stepped between the bullies and the frail old man in booth 7. Everyone thought she was just being kind to a regular customer, but when the entire restaurant dropped to their knees, she realized the trembling grandfather was the vampire king. Now his grateful eyes promised protection she never asked for and a debt she couldn't repay. Sophie's legs trembled as the silence stretched like a taut wire through Meridian's restaurant, every knee touching the worn wooden floor except hers, every head bowed except hers, and she stood there gripping her coffee pot with white knuckles while her mind struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. The old man in booth 7, the one she'd served chamomile tea and apple pie every Tuesday for 3 months, the one who always left exact change and never met her eyes, was rising from his seat with a fluid grace that belonged to predators and kings, his stooped shoulders straightening, his thin frame expanding with each breath until the air itself seemed to bend around him. His weathered face remained the same, lined with age spots and creased with what she'd assumed were laugh lines. But now she saw the truth in those pale blue eyes that held depths like winter oceans, ancient and cold and impossibly patient. When he spoke, his voice rolled through the restaurant like distant thunder, each word deliberate and weighted with centuries of command. Child, you have shown kindness to one who has forgotten its touch. The bullies who moments before had been shoving his walker and filming his shaking hands for their social media cruelty now pressed themselves against the far wall, their faces drained of color as whispers began to ripple through the kneeling crowd like wind through dead leaves. King Nikolai Drakul, Northern Covens, Blood King, Death Walker. The names hit Sophie's ears like physical blows, each one more impossible than the last, and she watched in numb horror as her manager Elena crawled forward on her knees, her usually commanding presence reduced to trembling servitude as she whispered explanations that made no sense. "The restaurant has always been neutral ground," Elena said, her voice shaking with terror and reverence. "Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. A place where the supernatural world touches the human one safely." Sophie's coffee pot slipped from her fingers and shattered on the floor, the crash echoing through the unnatural quiet like a gunshot, dark liquid spreading across the tiles in a pattern that looked disturbingly like spilled blood. She had interfered in vampire politics without knowing it, Elena continued, had stepped between powers older than nations, had defended a being who could level city blocks with a thought, and now every supernatural creature in the tri-state area would know her name by dawn. King Nikolai moved toward Sophie with steps that seemed to flow rather than fall, his approaching footfalls creating ripples in the very fabric of reality that made the air shimmer and dance around his advancing form. Each movement was measured, precise, like a choreographed ritual performed for an audience of gods. And Sophie found herself unable to step back, even as every instinct screamed at her to run. His hand, when it touched her shoulder, was cold as winter stone, but surprisingly gentle. And the moment his skin made contact with hers, she felt the full weight of his power washing over her like a tide of ancient starlight, terrible and beautiful, and utterly inhuman. The sensation was overwhelming, like standing at the edge of an infinite abyss, while lightning coursed through her veins, and she understood with crystal clarity that she stood in the presence of something that had walked the earth when her ancestors were painting on cave walls. "You defended me when you believed me defenseless," he said, and his accent carried the music of languages that had died before Christ was born, vowels that belonged to courts where men wore crowns of iron and gold. Such courage from a mortal is rare and precious beyond measure. Sophie tried to speak, to protest that she hadn't known, that she'd just been doing her job, that she was nobody special. But the words died in her throat as his pale eyes met hers, and she saw something there that made her chest tighten with unexpected emotion. Loneliness. Centuries of it, carved into his immortal soul like scars on ancient stone, And in that moment, she understood that her simple act of kindness had touched something in him that hadn't felt warmth in longer than her entire bloodline had existed. Before she could find her voice to object, or ask questions, or beg for her normal life back, he was speaking again, his words carrying the weight of law and binding magic as he declared before the assembled supernatural community that Sophie Martinez, waitress of Meridian's restaurant, was now under his personal protection by right of the blood debt. The words seemed to hang in the air like visible things, glowing with power that made her skin tingle, and she watched in fascination and terror as a small cut appeared on her palm without any blade touching her skin, a thin line that welled with bright red blood. The silver pendant he produced from somewhere in his old cardigan was beautiful and terrible, covered in symbols that hurt her eyes to look at directly, and when her blood dropped onto its surface, the metal burst into ethereal light that painted the restaurant in shades of blue and silver and starlight. The other customers, she realized with dawning horror, were not entirely human. The woman in the corner booth whose smile showed teeth just a little too sharp, the man by the window whose reflection in the glass was slightly off, the teenager at table 6 whose shadow moved independently of his body. They were all watching her with expressions that ranged from awe to concern to something that might have been hunger. Elena crawled closer on her knees, her face pale with shock as she explained in rapid whispers that the blood debt was not just protection, but binding, that Sophie was now marked in ways that would follow her beyond death, that every supernatural faction in the region would know she carried the Vampire King's favor, and that such knowledge was both shield and target in equal measure. The restaurant remained frozen in its strange tableau, every supernatural being still kneeling, while Sophie stood at the center of powers she couldn't begin to comprehend, the silver pendant now hanging around her neck on a chain that felt heavier than mountains despite being delicate as spider silk. King Nikolai stepped back, but his presence still filled the space around her like a protective cocoon of ancient magic, and she could feel the weight of his attention like a physical thing even when he wasn't looking directly at her. The bullies who had started this entire nightmare were still pressed against the wall, their phones forgotten on the floor where they'd dropped them in terror, their faces slack with the kind of primal fear that came from recognizing apex predators on an instinctual level. One of them, a college kid with expensive sneakers and a smirk that had vanished the moment Nikolai revealed his true nature, was making small whimpering sounds as he tried to edge toward the exit without drawing attention to himself. But the Vampire King's attention was entirely on Sophie now, studying her face with the intensity of someone trying to memorize every detail. And she realized with a jolt of something that wasn't quite fear, that she was looking back at him with equal fascination. Up close, his features were sharp and aristocratic, the kind of bone structure that belonged on classical sculptures. And though his hair was silver white with age, his skin held the pale luminescence of moonlight on fresh snow. There was something almost fragile about him, despite his obvious power, as if the centuries had worn him thin in places that had nothing to do with physical strength, and Sophie found herself wondering what it would be like to carry the loneliness she'd seen in his eyes for longer than entire civilizations had existed. The pendant around her neck pulsed with warmth against her chest, responding to her thoughts and emotions in ways that felt both intimate and invasive. And she understood without being told that this was only the beginning of changes that would ripple through her life like stones thrown into still water. Elena was still whispering explanations, talking about vampire hierarchies and supernatural politics and ancient laws that governed interactions between species. But Sophie found it hard to focus on the words when Nikolai was looking at her like she'd just handed him the sun. The other patrons were beginning to rise from their knees now that the formal declaration was complete, brushing off their clothes and returning to their meals and conversations as if nothing extraordinary had happened. But Sophie could feel their sideways glances and sense their whispered discussions about the human girl who had somehow earned the protection of the most powerful vampire in the Northern Territories. The pendant continued to pulse against her skin, warm and alive and somehow comforting, despite everything it represented. And when Nikolai finally spoke again, his voice was softer, almost gentle, as he told her that her life as she knew it was over, but that he would do everything in his considerable power to ensure she didn't regret the kindness she'd shown to a stranger. The bullies had finally managed to escape through the front door, stumbling over each other in their haste to flee, and Sophie realized with a mixture of relief and dread that word of what had happened here would spread through both human and supernatural communities faster than wildfire, marking her as someone significant in a world she'd never known existed until 10 minutes ago. Sophie pushed through the glass doors of Meridian's, her hands still trembling from the previous night's revelation. The familiar chime above the entrance sounded different now, almost warning, and the warm, amber lighting that once felt cozy now seemed to cast shadows that moved wrong. Elena stood behind the hostess station, her perfectly manicured fingers drumming against the mahogany surface, in a rhythm too slow for human heartbeat. When she looked up, her smile revealed the slightest hint of fangs, and Sophie realized she'd been blind to the signs for months. The woman who'd hired her, who'd covered her shifts when Danny needed surgery, who'd listened to her complaints about difficult customers, was a predator older than nations. Elena's laugh at Sophie's wide-eyed stare was musical and cold. "You're looking at me like you've never seen me before," she said, her accent carrying hints of something European and ancient. Sophie opened her mouth to speak, to ask the thousand questions burning in her throat, but Elena raised one pale hand for silence. The dinner rush was starting, and the first customers were already arriving. Sophie watched in growing amazement as beings she'd served countless times revealed their true nature through subtle signs she'd missed. The businessman in table 3, whose coffee never grew cold, whose reflection in the window seemed slightly out of sync, the elderly couple who ordered the same rare steaks every Tuesday, whose eyes flashed gold when the kitchen lights dimmed, the young woman who always requested the corner booth, whose shadow had too many angles and moved independently of her body. "They're all supernatural," Sophie whispered, and Elena nodded with grim satisfaction. "Meridian's has been neutral ground for over 2 centuries," she explained as she led Sophie to the break room. "A place where our kind can exist peacefully alongside humans who remain oblivious to our true nature. The restaurant exists in a space between worlds, protected by ancient accords and older magic." Sophie sank into the plastic chair beside the time clock, her legs suddenly weak. "But I'm human," she protested. "Why can I see them now?" Elena's expression grew serious as she perched on the edge of the table, her movements too fluid and graceful for mortality. "The blood debt changed you," she said. "When King Nikolai marked you as protected, it opened your eyes to our reality. You can never go back to ignorance, Sophie. Once you've seen the supernatural world, it sees you in return." The weight of those words settled over Sophie like a shroud. She thought of her small apartment, her evening classes at community college, her dreams of becoming a nurse and helping people. All of it seemed suddenly distant and fragile. Elena's voice softened with something that might have been sympathy. "The debt works both ways," she continued. "Nikolai owes you a favor equivalent to your kindness, but it also means every supernatural faction knows about you now. Some will try to use you to reach the Vampire King. Others will see you as a threat to the careful balance we've maintained for centuries." Sophie's blood chilled at the implications. What kind of threat? Elena's fangs were fully visible now, no longer hidden by human pretense. "You defended the most powerful vampire in the Northern Hemisphere when you thought he was just a helpless old man. That kind of courage from a mortal is rare and precious, but it also makes you dangerous. If humans knew what you know, if they understood that we live among them, it could shatter the peace we've built. Wars have been fought over less." The break room door swung open, and Sophie jumped as Marcus entered. She recognized him now, the too handsome man who'd been coming to Meridian's for the past few weeks, always requesting tables with clear sightlines to booth 7. His smile was sharp as broken glass, and his presence filled the small room with an oppressive energy that made Sophie's skin crawl. His suit was perfectly tailored, his dark hair swept back in a style that suggested old money and older power. Elena stiffened, her casual demeanor evaporating like mist. "Lord Marcus," she said, her voice carefully neutral. "You're early for your usual seating time." Marcus ignored her, his pale blue eyes fixed on Sophie with predatory intensity. "So this is the famous waitress who captured our king's attention," he said, his voice carrying a slight accent that could have been British or something much older. His gaze traveled over her like she was a piece of art he was considering purchasing. "I must say, I expected someone more extraordinary." Sophie stood slowly, every instinct screaming danger despite Marcus's civilized appearance. There was something fundamentally wrong about him, a coldness that had nothing to do with vampire physiology and everything to do with cruelty. Elena moved between them, her own supernatural nature becoming more apparent as stress heightened her otherworldly qualities. "This is neutral ground, Marcus," she warned. "The Accords guarantee safe passage for all beings within these walls." Marcus's laugh was like silver bells with poison centers. "Of course, my dear Elena. I would never dream of violating sanctuary law. I simply wanted to meet the remarkable young woman who's caused such a stir in our circles." He stepped closer, and Sophie caught the scent of expensive cologne and something underneath it, metallic and bitter. "Tell me, Miss Sophie, do you understand the magnitude of what you've done?" Sophie found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. "I helped someone who needed it. That's all." The simplicity of her answer seemed to amuse Marcus greatly. "How refreshingly naive," he said. "You've inserted yourself into a political game that's been playing out for centuries, child. The Vampire King hasn't taken a personal interest in a human for decades. Some might wonder why. Others might see opportunity." His words carried implications that made Sophie's stomach twist, but before she could respond, the temperature in the room dropped noticeably. Nikolai appeared in the doorway, no longer bothering with his frail human disguise. His presence was commanding, ancient authority radiating from him like heat from a forge. The casual cardigan and slacks he wore did nothing to diminish the power that seemed to bend reality around him. Marcus straightened, his casual cruelty replaced by wary respect. "Your Majesty," he said with a bow that managed to be both proper and mocking, "I was just introducing myself to your protégé." Nikolai's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of centuries and the promise of violence. "You were leaving, Marcus. The sanctuary's neutrality extends only to those who honor its purpose." Marcus's smile never wavered, but something dangerous flickered in his eyes. "Of course, Your Majesty. Perhaps we might continue our conversation another time, Miss Sophie, when you've had more time to understand your new circumstances." He moved toward the door, pausing just long enough to add, "I do hope your family appreciates how much your life has changed." The threat was subtle but unmistakable, and Sophie's blood turned to ice at the mention of Danny. Nikolai stepped aside to let Marcus pass, but the look that passed between the two vampires spoke of old enmity and promises of future conflict. When Marcus was gone, Elena sagged against the table, as if his presence had been physically exhausting. "He's testing boundaries," she said to Nikolai, "seeing how far he can push before you react." Sophie looked between them, understanding dawning. "He's your enemy." Nikolai's expression was grave as he turned to face her fully. "Marcus has been challenging my authority for over 50 years, he said. "He believes that my reluctance to use brutal methods makes me weak. Your protection of me has given him what he sees as proof of that weakness. A human's kindness shouldn't matter to a vampire king in his view." Elena moved to the window, checking that Marcus had actually left the premises. "He's been gathering support among the younger vampires," she told Sophie. "They're tired of hiding, tired of maintaining the careful balance we've built with human society." They want to rule openly, to take what they believe is rightfully theirs. Sophie felt the pieces clicking into place with horrible clarity. And my defending you gives him ammunition. It makes you look soft. Nikolai nodded, his ancient eyes heavy with regret. Your courage has become a weapon in his hands, though that was never your intention. He will try to use you, Sophie. Either to prove my judgment is compromised or to force me into actions that will justify his coup attempt. The magnitude of what she'd stumbled into was overwhelming. Sophie had thought she was simply helping an elderly man being bullied. Instead, she'd become a pawn in a supernatural power struggle that could affect both human and vampire societies. But as she looked at Nikolai, at the genuine concern and growing affection in his expression, she realized something else. Despite the danger, despite the impossible circumstances, she didn't regret her choice. The rest of the evening passed in a surreal haze as Sophie served customers who were no longer just customers. Every interaction carried new weight now that she could see past the human masks they wore. The werewolf pack that met for dinner every Thursday treated her with new deference, their eyes flickering gold when they caught her scent mixed with vampire pheromones. The Fey woman who always ordered herb tea watched her with calculating eyes that seemed to see too much. Even the humans seemed different, their oblivious chatter about mundane concerns creating a strange counterpoint to the supernatural tensions crackling through the air. Nikolai returned to booth 7 as promised, but his presence tonight was different. Gone was any pretense of frailty or age. He sat like the king he was, and other supernatural patrons paid him subtle homage as they passed. Yet when Sophie approached with his usual order, his smile was gentle, almost shy. You're adjusting well to the truth, he said. His voice pitched low enough that only her enhanced hearing could catch it. She set down his coffee, noting that steam rose from it despite his lack of body heat. I'm trying, she admitted. It's a lot to process. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and touched her hand briefly. The contact sent shivers through her that had nothing to do with his supernatural cold, and everything to do with the growing connection between them. You don't have to stay, he said quietly. I could arrange for your memories to be altered, for you to return to your old life. The offer should have been tempting, but Sophie found herself shaking her head before he finished speaking. No, she said firmly. I won't run from this. Whatever comes next, I want to face it with my eyes open. Nikolai's smile was radiant, transforming his austere features into something breathtakingly beautiful. That courage that first drew my attention hasn't dimmed, he said. But Sophie, you must understand the cost. Marcus won't stop with subtle threats. He'll escalate until one of us breaks, and I won't let harm come to you or your family. The evening ended with Sophie counting her tips with hands that barely shook, but her mind was spinning with new realities. As she prepared to leave, Elena handed her a small silver pendant on a delicate chain. Wear this always, she said. It will help mask your scent from hostile vampires and call for help if you're in immediate danger. The metal was warm against Sophie's palm, pulsing faintly with its own energy. Walking to her car under the parking lot's fluorescent lights, Sophie felt the weight of watching eyes from the shadows. The world looked the same, but everything had changed. She was no longer just a waitress trying to make ends meet while finishing school. She was a player in a game she barely understood, protected by a vampire king and targeted by his enemies. The thought should have terrified her, but as she started her car and drove home through the familiar streets of her ordinary neighborhood, Sophie felt something unexpected stirring in her chest. For the first time in years, her life had real purpose and meaning. Whatever came next, she would face it standing tall, just as she had in that restaurant when she'd stepped between the bullies and the man she thought needed her protection. The vampire king needed her protection still, she realized, just in ways she was only beginning to understand. Nikolai's invitation arrived the next evening wrapped in parchment so old it seemed to whisper with age when Sophie unfolded it, the ink flowing across the page in script that belonged to another century entirely. The words themselves were formal, courtly, speaking of honor and protection and the pleasure of her company at the monthly gathering of the Crimson Court. But beneath the elaborate language, Sophie sensed something deeper and more personal. She found him waiting in booth 7 as always, but tonight his usual casual attire had been replaced by clothing that spoke of old nobility, a midnight blue coat that seemed to absorb light and trousers that fit him like they'd been tailored by masters who understood both human form and supernatural grace. When she approached with his order, he looked up at her with eyes that held centuries of longing and loss. "This is not merely about repaying the blood debt," he said quietly, his voice carrying undertones that made her pulse quicken. "There are those at court who question my judgment in protecting a human, and others who seek to use you as a weapon against me. By bringing you before them as my honored guest, I'm making a declaration that will change everything between us and everything about your place in this world." Sophie set down his coffee with hands that barely trembled, though her heart was racing fast enough that she was certain he could hear it. "What kind of declaration?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer from the way he looked at her, like she was something precious and fragile and worth protecting at any cost. Nikolai reached into his coat and withdrew a dress box that was far too large to have been hidden there, the magic involved in its concealment making the air shimmer around his hands. "This belonged to someone very dear to me long ago," he said, his voice heavy with memories that predated her entire bloodline. "Her name was Catherine, and she had your courage, your kindness, your refusal to bow before those who would intimidate her. She died defending mortals from vampires who saw humans as nothing more than cattle, and I loved her for her strength even as it destroyed us both." The dress inside the box was breathtaking, made of silk so fine it seemed to float like captured moonlight, embroidered with silver threads that formed patterns of stars and roses in designs that hurt to look at directly. When Sophie lifted it from its tissue wrapping, she felt the weight of enchantment woven into every stitch, protective magic that would shield her from some supernatural influences while marking her unmistakably as being under the Vampire King's personal protection. The moment the fabric touched her skin, she felt Catherine's presence like an echo, a woman who had loved Nikolai with a fierce devotion that transcended death itself, and Sophie understood with crystal clarity that wearing this dress was accepting a role that had been vacant for over 2 centuries. Elena appeared at their table as if summoned, her expression grave as she took in the significance of the dress and the implications of Nikolai's invitation. "The Crimson Court is not a place for the unprepared," she warned Sophie. "Every gesture has meaning, every word carries weight, and the wrong response to the wrong question can mean death or worse." She insisted on closing the restaurant early to spend the evening teaching Sophie the intricate dance of vampire etiquette, the subtle language of bows and glances and carefully chosen phrases that would allow her to navigate court politics without inadvertently declaring war or offering insult that could not be forgiven. The rules were Byzantine in their complexity, layered with centuries of tradition and precedent, and Sophie's head spun as Elena explained the hierarchy of seating arrangements, the significance of accepting or declining offered refreshment, the meaning behind different types of acknowledgement from vampires of various ranks and ages. "You must never look directly into the eyes of an elder, unless they speak to you first," Elena instructed, as she helped Sophie into the enchanted dress, its fabric conforming to her body, like it had been made specifically for her. "Never accept gifts from anyone but Nikolai. Never turn your back on Marcus or his allies, and never, under any circumstances, show fear even if you're terrified beyond words." The mansion that housed the Crimson Court existed in a space between dimensions, accessible only through a doorway that appeared in different locations each month but always required invitation and safe passage to enter. Tonight it manifested as an ornate black door set into the brick wall of an abandoned warehouse. But when Nikolai escorted Sophie across its threshold, they stepped into opulent grandeur that belonged to another world entirely. The interior defied physical laws, with rooms that were larger than the building could possibly contain, staircases that led to balconies suspended in impossible spaces, and windows that looked out onto starscapes that had never been visible from Earth. Vampires moved through the elaborate spaces like living works of art, their inhuman beauty enhanced by clothing that ranged from medieval court dress to modern haute couture, each outfit chosen to display their age, power, and allegiances in ways that only the initiated could read. Sophie felt every eye turned toward her as Nikolai led her through the receiving hall, her human warmth and mortal scent announcing her nature as clearly as a herald's trumpet. But the enchanted dress protected her from the worst of their supernatural predatory instincts. Conversations paused as they passed, and Sophie caught fragments of discussion in languages she couldn't identify, though the tone was universal enough that she understood the speculation and controversy her presence had created. Ancient beings who had witnessed the rise and fall of empires watched her with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt to something that might have been hunger. And Sophie realized she was looking at vampires who had shaped human history from the shadows, who had whispered in the ears of kings and emperors and presidents throughout the centuries. Nikolai presented her with formal courtesy to various members of court, introducing her as his honored guest and protected ward, each introduction carrying weight and significance that she could feel but not fully understand. The vampires she met were polite, even gracious. But beneath their civilized veneer, she sensed the same predatory calculation she'd seen in Marcus, the constant evaluation of strength and weakness that seemed to define their social interactions. They spoke to her of inconsequential things: the weather, the beauty of her dress, the honor of meeting the famous mortal who had captured their king's attention. But their questions probed for information about her background, her family, her hopes and fears in ways that made her grateful for Elena's coaching in evasion and misdirection. The evening proceeded with elaborate formality until Marcus arrived with his entourage, his presence changing the entire atmosphere of the gathering like storm clouds blotting out the sun. He moved through the crowd with predatory grace, his followers arranging themselves in patterns that spoke of military precision and barely restrained violence. And Sophie felt the tension in the room ratchet upward as vampires chose sides or carefully positioned themselves in neutral territory. When he finally approached Nikolai and Sophie, his smile was sharp enough to cut glass, and his bow was perfectly correct while managing to convey mockery and challenge in equal measure. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet hall. "How delightful to see you've brought your pet human to court. I trust she's house-trained." The insult was deliberate and calculated, designed to provoke Nikolai into an angry response that would justify Marcus's next move. But the Vampire King's expression remained serenely composed, even as the temperature around them dropped several degrees. Marcus's smile widened as he turned to address the assembled court directly. "I invoke the right of question," he declared, his words ringing through the hall like a challenge bell. "Let this mortal prove her worthiness to stand among us, or let her be revealed as the weakness that compromises our king's judgment." The right of question was ancient law, Elena had warned Sophie, but she'd hoped it would never be invoked. Any court member could demand that a human prove their worth through trial, and refusal would mean banishment or death, depending on the circumstances. Sophie felt the weight of every gaze in the hall focusing on her as servants appeared with a silver tray bearing 3 crystal goblets, each filled with liquid that looked identical in the dim candlelight. The rules were simple and deadly, Marcus explained with obvious relish. 1 goblet contained wine that would allow her to remain human and under royal protection. 1 contained vampire blood that would begin her transformation into one of their kind, binding her to vampire society forever, but granting her supernatural strength and immortality. 1 contained poison that would kill her within minutes, but would do so painlessly if she faced death with courage. She must choose without knowing which was which, based purely on instinct, trust, and whatever guidance her protector might provide through means that did not constitute direct assistance. The hall fell silent as Sophie approached the tray, her heart hammering against her ribs, hard enough that she was certain every vampire present could hear it. But she kept her expression calm and her movements steady, despite the terror coursing through her veins. She looked at Nikolai, whose face was a mask of controlled anguish, knowing that he couldn't help her directly without violating the ancient laws that governed the trial. But in his eyes she saw something else, a flicker of communication that bypassed words entirely, a message that spoke of love and trust and faith in her ability to read the truth beneath surface appearances. The 3 goblets gleamed in the candlelight, their contents dark and mysterious, and Sophie realized that this moment would define not just her survival, but her entire future relationship with the supernatural world. She thought of Catherine, the woman whose dress she wore, who had faced similar trials with courage that had inspired a vampire king to love her despite the impossibility of their union. She thought of her brother Danny, of Elena's warnings, of Marcus's cruel smile as he waited for her to make a fatal mistake. And then she thought of Nikolai, of the loneliness she'd seen in his ancient eyes, of the way he'd looked at her like she'd given him something precious and irreplaceable. And she knew with sudden clarity that trust was the only weapon she had in this deadly game. Sophie reached for the middle goblet with steady hands, lifting it toward her lips while maintaining eye contact with Nikolai, letting him see that her choice was based not on fear or desperation, but on absolute faith in the connection that had formed between them. The liquid was warm against her lips, flowing across her tongue with flavors that spoke of sunshine and growing things and life itself. And as she drained the goblet completely, she heard Nikolai's soft exhale of relief and saw Marcus's expression shift from anticipation to frustrated rage. She had chosen correctly, had trusted in Nikolai's guidance conveyed through nothing more than the language of the heart, and as the court erupted in surprised murmurs and grudging applause, Sophie understood that she had passed more than just a test of survival. She had proven herself worthy of standing at the side of the vampire king, had earned the respect of beings who measured courage in centuries rather than moments, and had taken another irreversible step deeper into a world where love and death danced together under starlight that had never touched mortal skies. The wine burned down Sophie's throat like liquid courage, each swallow a victory against the terror that had threatened to paralyze her moments before. But as the court erupted in murmurs of approval and barely concealed surprise, she saw that Marcus's expression had shifted from anticipatory pleasure to cold calculation. The right of question had failed to eliminate her, but rather than accepting defeat, he seemed to be mentally adjusting his strategy for a longer and more complex game. Nikolai appeared at her side instantly, his relief palpable as he placed a protective hand on her arm, but Sophie could see the fury burning behind his controlled expression, the ancient rage of a king whose authority had been challenged and whose beloved had been threatened before his entire court. The assembled vampires began to disperse, returning to their previous conversations with the studied casualness of those who had witnessed significant political theater, but knew better than to discuss it openly. Yet Sophie felt their sideways glances and whispered speculations following her like invisible hands. Marcus approached with deliberate slowness, his entourage maintaining perfect formation behind him, and when he spoke, his voice carried just far enough to be heard by anyone still paying attention. "Well done, Miss Sophie," he said with a smile that revealed too much fang to be entirely civilized. "Your trust in His Majesty's guidance is truly touching. I do hope that same trust extends to protecting those you hold dear." The words seemed innocent enough to casual observers, but Sophie felt their weight like a physical blow, understanding instinctively that beneath the polite congratulations lay a threat that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. Nikolai's grip on her arm tightened, his supernatural hearing having caught nuances in Marcus's tone that promised future violence. But the challenger had been careful to phrase his words in ways that skated just within the bounds of acceptable court discourse. "It would be such a tragedy," Marcus continued with mock concern, "if your newfound prominence brought unwanted attention to your family members. Your brother Daniel, isn't it? Such a dedicated young man, working those late-night shifts at Henderson's auto repair downtown. The neighborhood can be so dangerous after midnight, especially for mortals who don't understand the predators that hunt in darkness." Sophie's world tilted sickeningly as she realized that Marcus had been investigating her background, mapping her vulnerabilities with the thoroughness of a military strategist preparing for siege warfare. Danny worked alone most nights, staying late to finish repairs that paid the overtime they desperately needed. And the thought of supernatural predators stalking him through empty streets made her stomach clench with protective fury. Nikolai's voice, when he spoke, carried the weight of absolute authority and barely restrained violence. "You walk dangerous ground, Marcus," he said, each word precise and deadly. "The laws of sanctuary protect all mortals under royal decree, and any harm that befalls them will be answered in kind." But Marcus had clearly prepared for this response, his smile widening as he gestured toward the assembled court with theatrical innocence. "Of course, Your Majesty," he replied smoothly. "I would never dream of violating sanctuary law. I merely express concern for the safety of all mortals in our territory, especially those whose connection to court members might make them targets for less scrupulous supernatural beings. It's truly unfortunate that your protection cannot extend beyond the individual you've chosen to shield." The legal distinction was crucial and infuriating, Sophie realized as she watched the exchange with growing dread. Vampire law apparently protected specific individuals who had been formally marked, but their family members remained vulnerable unless separately designated for protection. And such extensions of royal protection required complex political justifications that could take months to arrange through proper channels. Marcus was exploiting a loophole that allowed him to threaten Danny without technically breaking any laws that would justify immediate retaliation from the Vampire King. The rest of the evening passed in a haze of forced normalcy as Sophie smiled and conversed with court members who treated her with new respect tinged by wariness. But her mind was spinning with desperate calculations about Danny's safety and the impossible position Marcus had maneuvered her into. Every laugh felt hollow, every polite exchange a mockery when she knew her brother was working alone in a garage that might as well have a target painted on its roof, vulnerable to creatures that could tear him apart without even breathing hard. Nikolai remained close to her side throughout the remainder of the gathering, his presence both comforting and frustrating because she could see the helpless rage burning behind his composed facade. The ancient king reduced to impotence by laws and protocols that prevented him from simply eliminating a threat to those he cared about. The ride back to her apartment was conducted in tense silence, Nikolai's driver navigating streets that seemed darker and more threatening than they had just hours before, every shadow potentially concealing enemies who might already be moving against her family while she attended supernatural social functions. When they finally arrived at her building, Nikolai walked her to the door with old-world courtesy that felt almost absurd given the circumstances. But as she turned to thank him for the evening, he caught her hand in his with gentle urgency. "Sophie," he said quietly, his voice heavy with centuries of experience in political warfare. "You must promise me that you will not attempt to handle this alone. Marcus is older and more cunning than you can imagine, and any bargain you might think to strike with him will only strengthen his position while placing you in greater danger." She nodded agreement while mentally crossing her fingers, knowing even as she spoke that she couldn't simply wait for diplomatic solutions when Danny's life hung in the balance like a sword suspended by spider silk. The moment Nikolai's car disappeared around the corner, Sophie was pulling out her phone and scrolling through Marcus's contact information, which he had oh so helpfully provided along with his business card during their first encounter at the restaurant. The number connected on the second ring, and his voice carried smug satisfaction as if he had been expecting her call. "Miss Sophie," he said warmly, "how delightful to hear from you so soon. I trust you enjoyed your first taste of court politics." The small talk felt like torture when every moment of delay increased Danny's vulnerability, but Sophie forced herself to match his casual tone while her heart hammered against her ribs. "I want to meet with you," she said as calmly as possible, "to discuss the concerns you raised about my family's safety." Marcus's laugh was musical and cruel, the sound of someone who had maneuvered an opponent exactly where he wanted them. "How wonderfully direct," he replied. "I do appreciate mortals who understand the value of practical solutions. There's a coffee shop called Midnight Grounds on 5th Street that caters to our kind. Meet me there in 1 hour and come alone." The phone went dead, leaving Sophie staring at her reflection in the darkened window while her mind raced through increasingly desperate scenarios. She changed out of Catherine's dress with hands that shook despite her efforts to remain calm, hanging the enchanted garment carefully in her closet like armor being stored after battle, and dressed in ordinary clothes that felt strange and inadequate after hours of supernatural pageantry. The drive to 5th Street took her through parts of downtown she rarely visited, neighborhoods where the streetlights seemed dimmer, and the spaces between buildings held shadows that moved in ways that defied natural physics. And she realized she was entering territory where the supernatural world operated more openly than in the carefully maintained neutral ground of Meridian's restaurant. Midnight Grounds occupied the ground floor of a building that looked ordinary from the outside, but hummed with energy that made her skin crawl the moment she stepped through its door. And Sophie understood immediately why Marcus had chosen this location for their meeting. The coffee shop existed in a space similar to Meridian's, but without the protections of sanctuary law, a place where vampires and other supernatural beings could conduct business without the restrictions that governed more formal venues. Marcus was waiting at a corner table that offered clear sightlines to all entrances and exits, dressed casually but expensively. And when he smiled at her approach, Sophie felt like a mouse walking voluntarily into a trap that had been specifically designed to catch her particular species. "Please sit," he said with mock courtesy, gesturing to the chair across from him. "I've taken the liberty of ordering you coffee, though I suspect you're far too nervous to appreciate good Brazilian beans." Sophie forced herself to sit with as much dignity as possible, meeting his gaze directly despite the predatory gleam she saw there, and when she spoke, her voice was steadier than she felt. "What do you want?" she asked bluntly, abandoning any pretense of social niceties. Marcus leaned back in his chair with obvious satisfaction, clearly enjoying her directness and the desperation that drove it. "What I want, my dear Sophie, is to save vampire society from a king whose judgment has been compromised by sentiment and nostalgia. Nikolai has ruled for over 3 centuries, and during that time he has allowed our kind to live in shadows, hiding our true nature, accepting scraps of territory and influence when we could command entire nations. His policies of coexistence with humanity have made us weak, dependent on their ignorance for our very survival, and now his attachment to you proves that he values mortal approval over vampire interests." The speech had the feel of something rehearsed and refined through multiple tellings, and Sophie realized she was hearing the core arguments Marcus used to recruit followers to his cause. But beneath his political rhetoric, she sensed something more personal, a resentment that went beyond mere disagreement with royal policy. "You're not doing this for vampire society," she said, surprising herself with her boldness. "This is about you wanting to be king." Marcus's smile widened approvingly, as if she had passed some kind of test. "Precisely," he said without shame. "I have waited centuries for the throne, watched Nikolai make decision after decision that weakens our position in the world. And his protection of you represents the ultimate symbol of his unfitness to rule. A vampire king who risks political stability for the sake of a mortal's safety is a king who has forgotten what it means to put his people first." Sophie felt the pieces of his strategy clicking into place with horrible clarity. "You want me to refuse his protection when he needs my support most?" she said quietly. You want to prove that his feelings for me make him vulnerable. Marcus nodded with obvious pride in her comprehension. When the time comes, and it will come soon, you will have a choice, he said, his voice taking on the cadence of someone delivering an ultimatum. Stand by Nikolai's side when he faces the challenge I will bring before the full court, and prove that his attachment to you strengthens rather than weakens his position, or step aside and demonstrate that mortal loyalty is as fragile as mortal flesh. If you choose to support him, your brother will suffer a series of increasingly severe accidents until you learn the proper lesson. If you choose wisely and help me prove Nikolai's unfitness to rule, Daniel will live a long and healthy life, completely unaware of how close he came to becoming collateral damage in vampire politics. The coffee shop around them continued its ordinary business, supernatural patrons conducting their affairs with the casual efficiency of those accustomed to operating in shadows. But Sophie felt as if she and Marcus were suspended in a bubble of threat and negotiation that isolated them from the rest of reality. She thought of Danny laughing at her stories about difficult customers, Danny working double shifts to help pay for her college classes, Danny who had no idea that his sister's kindness to a lonely old man had made him a target in a game played by immortal predators with centuries to perfect their cruelty. The weight of impossible choice pressed down on her like physical force, and she realized that no matter what decision she made, she would be betraying someone she cared about. Help Marcus destroy the vampire king who had shown her kindness and protection, or watch her brother pay the price for her refusal to participate in supernatural treachery. Marcus watched her internal struggle with obvious satisfaction, clearly confident that he had maneuvered her into a position where victory was inevitable regardless of her choice, and Sophie understood with crystalline clarity that she was facing the true cost of entering a world where love and loyalty were weapons to be used by those with enough patience and ruthlessness to wield them effectively. Sophie pushed through the familiar doors of Meridian's the next evening, her movements mechanical as she tried to process the impossible choice Marcus had forced upon her. But the restaurant that had once felt like sanctuary now seemed charged with an undercurrent of tension that made her skin crawl. Elena took one look at her face and immediately guided her to the break room, closing the door firmly behind them while her expression shifted from concern to grim understanding. You met with Marcus, she said. And it wasn't a question, but a statement of fact delivered with the weary resignation of someone who had seen this particular tragedy play out before. Sophie nodded numbly, sinking into the plastic chair that had become her confessional over the past few weeks, as her ordinary life crumbled around the edges like a photograph left too long in sunlight. He threatened Danny, she whispered, her voice barely audible even in the small enclosed space. He said if I don't help prove that Nikolai is unfit to rule, my brother will have accidents until I learn the proper lesson. Elena's face went pale, her vampire complexion taking on the translucent quality of old porcelain as she absorbed the implications of Marcus's ultimatum. The bastard, she breathed, her careful composure cracking to reveal centuries of controlled fury. He's using the same playbook he's used 3 times before, exploiting the one weakness that every vampire king eventually develops. Sophie's blood chilled at the mention of previous victims, and she found herself asking the question even though part of her already dreaded the answer. 3 times before, she repeated slowly. Elena moved to the small window that looked out over the dining room, where Nikolai sat in his usual booth, his presence drawing subtle acknowledging nods from other supernatural patrons, even as he maintained his facade of simple humanity. There have been 3 other human women over the centuries who earned Nikolai's protection and affection, Elena said quietly, her voice heavy with old grief. Catherine was the first, back in the 1700s, a baker's daughter who showed him kindness when he was injured and alone. Maria came during the Industrial Revolution, a factory worker who helped him understand how the changing world was affecting mortals. And Sarah, just 40 years ago, a nurse who tended wounded soldiers during wartime without regard for their nationality or allegiances. Each time, Nikolai found himself drawn to their courage, their compassion, their refusal to be intimidated by forces beyond their control, and each time, his enemies used that connection to orchestrate their destruction. Sophie felt sick as the pattern became clear, understanding that she was following a script that had been written in blood and repeated across generations of supernatural politics. "What happened to them?" she asked, though part of her already knew the answer would be unbearable. Elena's reflection in the window seemed to age before Sophie's eyes, showing glimpses of the ancient vampire beneath her carefully maintained human appearance. Catherine died in a carriage accident, arranged to look like highwayman robbery, but the horses were spooked by vampire pheromones, and the attackers knew exactly where to find her traveling alone. Maria was killed in a factory fire that started in a section of building where she was working late, trapped by doors that had been mysteriously barred from the outside. Sarah died in what appeared to be a random mugging near the hospital where she worked, but the wounds were too precise, too calculated, and she was found drained of blood, though the human authorities attributed that to the severity of her injuries. Each death was arranged to look like mortal misfortune, staying just within the boundaries of vampire law that prohibited direct attacks on those under royal protection, but leaving no doubt about the true cause or the message being sent. Sophie's hands trembled as she processed the full scope of what she was facing, realizing that Marcus's threat to Danny wasn't just manipulation, but part of a campaign that had been refined through centuries of practice. "And Nikolai couldn't stop them," she said, understanding the futility that must have driven the vampire king to increasing isolation and despair. Elena shook her head sadly, her expression reflecting the helplessness of someone who had watched these tragedies unfold without being able to prevent them. Vampire law is ancient and complex, designed to prevent the kind of open warfare that nearly destroyed our society in earlier centuries, she explained. Direct threats against those under royal protection constitute acts of rebellion that justify immediate retaliation, but indirect consequences, accidents, the actions of supposedly independent agents, these fall into legal gray areas that require formal investigation and tribunal proceedings that can take years to resolve. By the time justice is served, if it ever is, the damage has been done and the political point has been made. Marcus and his predecessors have always been careful to maintain plausible deniability while making their true intentions absolutely clear. When Sophie finally approached Nikolai's booth that evening, her distress was apparently written clearly across her face because his expression immediately shifted from welcoming warmth to sharp concern. And she realized that centuries of experience in reading human emotions made her transparent to his ancient eyes. He gestured for her to sit across from him, abandoning any pretense of casual customer interaction as the gravity of the situation demanded honesty between them. "Marcus threatened your brother," he said quietly, and again it wasn't a question but a statement of certainty, delivered with the resignation of someone who had seen this pattern before. Sophie nodded, tears threatening despite her efforts to remain composed. And when she tried to explain the impossible choice Marcus had given her, Nikolai's expression darkened with fury that made the air around their booth drop several degrees. "The clever bastard," Nikolai said, his voice carrying undertones of rage that spoke to his true supernatural nature. "He's using Danny as leverage to force you into a position where any choice you make serves his agenda, either abandoning me when he issues his formal challenge or providing him with justification for escalating his attacks on your family." Sophie felt the last of her composure cracking as she realized the full scope of the trap that had been laid for them both. "What formal challenge?" she asked, though she suspected the answer would only make their situation worse. Nikolai's eyes held the weariness of someone who had played this game too many times and lost too much to political maneuvering that turned love into weakness and compassion into vulnerability. "He will invoke the right of substitution during the next new moon," Nikolai explained, his voice heavy with centuries of bitter experience. "An ancient law that allows a protected human to refuse their guardian's aid in a trial by combat, thereby proving that the vampire's protection is unwanted and his judgment compromised. If you stand aside when he challenges me directly, it will be seen as evidence that my attachment to mortals makes me unfit to rule, providing legal justification for his coup attempt. But if you accept my protection and support me through the trial, I'll be forced to face him in single combat, under conditions he's been preparing for decades, while I've grown weaker through isolation and the burden of ruling fractured clans that barely acknowledge my authority. Sophie stared at him in horror as she understood the true scope of Marcus's strategy, realizing that every move had been calculated to create a scenario where victory was impossible and defeat inevitable, regardless of the choices made by those caught in his web. "You're going to fight him," she said, and it wasn't a question, because she could see the decision already made in his ancient eyes, the grim acceptance of someone who would rather face death with honor than live with the knowledge that his weakness had cost innocent lives. Nikolai reached across the table and took her hand in his, the contact sending familiar shivers through her that had nothing to do with his supernatural cold, and everything to do with the connection that had formed between them despite the impossibility of their circumstances. "I have fought for centuries to maintain peace between our kinds," he said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of accumulated loss and regret. "I have watched the women I cared about die because my enemies knew that threatening them was the most effective way to attack me. And I have endured the isolation that came from understanding that love was a luxury I couldn't afford without risking those I claimed to protect. But I cannot and will not abandon you to Marcus's mercy, simply because the alternative involves personal risk." Sophie felt tears starting to flow despite her efforts to maintain composure, understanding that she was watching a man who had already lost everything that mattered to him prepare to lose even more rather than compromise his principles. The dining room around them continued its ordinary business, supernatural patrons conducting their affairs with practiced discretion, while the vampire king and his human protege discussed matters of life and death in voices too low to be overheard by casual eavesdroppers. The formal challenge arrived 3 nights later in the form of an ornate invitation written on parchment that smelled of old blood and older magic, delivered by Marcus himself during the dinner rush in a display of theatrical arrogance that drew the attention of every supernatural being in the restaurant. He approached Nikolai's booth with predatory confidence, his entourage arranging themselves in formation that spoke of military precision and barely contained violence, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly through the suddenly quiet dining room. "Your Majesty," he said with mock courtesy that fooled nobody present, "I bring formal notification of my intent to invoke the right of substitution regarding your protection of the mortal Sophie Martinez. The ancient laws require that such challenges be answered within 7 days at a location of neutral ground, and I propose the ceremonial chamber beneath this very establishment where our kind has settled disputes for over 2 centuries." Nikolai accepted the challenge with quiet dignity that spoke to his royal breeding and centuries of experience in supernatural politics. But Sophie could see the weight of accumulated dread settling over his shoulders like a shroud. The basement of Meridian's was a place she'd never seen, Elena explained later, as she led Sophie down stone steps that descended far deeper than the building's foundation should have allowed, carved from living rock by vampire artisans who understood the symbolic importance of sacred spaces. The dueling circle had been cut into the floor with tools blessed by ancient magic, its boundaries marked with silver inlay that glowed with faint light in the underground darkness, and the chamber itself existed in a space between dimensions where supernatural law held absolute sway and mortal concerns held no weight whatsoever. Representatives from all the major vampire clans would attend, Elena continued as they examined the space where Sophie's fate would be decided in just 4 days. "They'll come to witness whether their king retains the strength to rule or whether Marcus's claims about his weakness prove justified through trial by combat. And their decision about who deserves their allegiance will determine the future of vampire society for generations to come." Sophie stood in the center of the ancient circle, feeling the weight of centuries pressing down on her from the carved walls that held memories of countless duels and political struggles. And she understood with crystal clarity that she was about to become the focal point of a conflict that would determine whether the supernatural world continued its careful coexistence with humanity or descended into the kind of open warfare that would destroy both species. The right of substitution would give her the power to refuse Nikolai's protection at the crucial moment, to step aside and watch him face Marcus alone without the moral support that might make the difference between victory and defeat. But she also understood that accepting his protection meant watching two ancient beings fight to the death over principles and politics that she barely comprehended. Marcus's trap was perfect in its cruel simplicity, offering her the choice between betraying someone she'd grown to love or watching him die for the sake of protecting her from consequences she'd never asked to face. And as she stood in that underground chamber where vampire justice had been dispensed for centuries, Sophie realized that the game had always been rigged from the moment she'd chosen to defend a lonely old man from a group of bullies who'd never understood the magnitude of forces they were unleashing with their casual cruelty. Sophie stood at the edge of the ancient dueling circle as midnight approached, the weight of her decisions settling over her like armor forged from love and desperation, while around the underground chamber representatives from every major vampire clan took their positions in the carved stone galleries that rose like amphitheater seating into the shadows above. The ceremonial torches cast dancing light across faces that had witnessed the rise and fall of empires, their inhuman beauty made terrible by the hunger for violence that gleamed in two bright eyes, and Sophie understood that she was about to watch two beings she cared about attempt to destroy each other according to laws that predated human civilization. Nikolai entered the circle from the eastern arch, moving with fluid grace that spoke to his supernatural nature, dressed in midnight black that seemed to absorb the flickering torchlight, while silver threads embroidered along his sleeves caught and reflected the flame like captured starlight. The blade he carried was ancient beyond measure, its steel forged in an age when vampire smiths understood secrets of metallurgy that human science had yet to rediscover. And when he looked at Sophie standing just beyond the circle's boundary, his expression held love and regret in equal measure. Marcus appeared from the western entrance with theatrical flourish, his own weapon gleaming like liquid mercury in the uncertain light, and his smile was sharp enough to cut glass as he acknowledged the assembled court with a bow that managed to be both respectful and mocking. The formal declarations were made in languages that hurt Sophie's ears to hear, ancient words of challenge and acceptance that bound both combatants to fight until one yielded or died. And she realized with growing dread that vampire law made no provision for mercy or surrender once blood had been drawn in formal combat. When the signal was given, the two vampires moved with speed that made them blur and dance like shadows come to life, their blades meeting in showers of sparks that illuminated the circle in stroboscopic flashes, while the sound of steel on steel rang through the chamber like deadly music. Sophie watched in fascinated horror as Nikolai fought with controlled precision, each strike calculated and measured. But she could see that something was wrong with his technique, that he was holding back in ways that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with the presence of fragile mortal flesh, standing just beyond the protective boundaries of the ancient circle. Marcus, however, fought without restraint, his blade work flowing like lethal poetry as he pressed his attacks with increasing aggression. And Sophie realized with sick certainty that Nikolai's concern for her safety was preventing him from accessing the full extent of his supernatural power. The watching court murmured among themselves as the duel progressed, their whispered conversations audible to Sophie's enhanced hearing as they discussed the implications of what they were witnessing with the clinical detachment of beings who had seen countless such contests over the centuries. Marcus's supporters pointed out each instance where Nikolai's restraint cost him advantage, each moment where his awareness of Sophie's presence seemed to limit his tactical options, and Sophie heard the subtle shift in their voices as doubt began to creep in regarding their king's fitness to rule. "He's holding back because of the mortal," one voice whispered from the shadows above. "A king should think of his people first, not the safety of a single human." Marcus himself seemed to understand the political theater he was performing as well as the physical combat, calling out observations between strikes that were clearly intended for the assembled court rather than his opponent. "See how he limits himself, Your Majesty," Marcus said as his blade traced a line of silver fire through the air where Nikolai's head had been moments before. "See how concern for one fragile mortal makes you weak when our people need strength." The words carried weight beyond their literal meaning, and Sophie watched in growing despair as several court members nodded in agreement with Marcus's assessment, their ancient faces showing the kind of calculating consideration that suggested political loyalties might be shifting in real time. Nikolai's response came through action rather than words, his next series of attacks flowing with increased intensity that drove Marcus back several steps. But Sophie could see the cost of that effort in the slight tremor that ran through his frame when he thought no one was watching. The duel had been going on for nearly 20 minutes, and even supernatural endurance had its limits when pushed to these extremes under the weight of centuries of accumulated fatigue and the burden of ruling fractured clans that barely acknowledged his authority. Blood began to flow as both combatants sustained minor wounds, the scent filling the chamber with metallic sweetness that made the watching vampires shift restlessly in their stone seats, their predatory instincts responding to the promise of violence, even as their political calculations continued in whispered conferences that carried undertones of conspiracy and ambition. Sophie felt helpless rage building in her chest as she watched Nikolai continue to fight with one hand metaphorically tied behind his back, his love and concern for her safety being used as a weapon against him by an enemy who understood exactly how to exploit the perceived weakness of caring about mortal life. The assembled court was growing restless, their whispered discussions becoming more pointed, as they debated whether a king, who could be compromised by attachment to a human, possessed the ruthless pragmatism necessary to rule their kind in an increasingly dangerous world. She thought of Elena's warnings about vampire politics, about the deadly games played by immortal beings who measured loyalty in centuries rather than years, and she understood that Nikolai was fighting not just for his own life, but for the principles that had guided his reign and the future of human-vampire coexistence. Marcus landed a significant blow that sent Nikolai staggering, the ancient king's blood spattering across the silver inlay that marked the circle's boundaries, and the challenger's smile widened with triumphant malice as he pressed his advantage with renewed aggression. "This is what weakness looks like," he called to the watching court, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber, despite the continued clash of blades. "This is what happens when a king values mortal sentiment over vampire strength." Sophie felt something snap inside her chest as she watched the man she'd grown to love being systematically destroyed by his own compassion, and in that moment of desperate clarity, she remembered Elena's late-night lessons about vampire law and the obscure rites that governed supernatural society. The right of heart's truth was ancient beyond measure, rarely invoked and dangerous to attempt, but it allowed a human to speak for their vampire protector's character before the assembled court in circumstances where that character was being questioned through trial by combat. Before rational thought could stop her, Sophie stepped across the silver boundary into the dueling circle itself, her presence causing both combatants to freeze mid-strike as the violation of sacred law sent shockwaves through the watching assembly. The chamber erupted in outraged voices as court members rose from their seats, some calling for her immediate death for violating the sanctity of formal combat, while others demanded to know what ancient right she thought she was invoking to justify such unprecedented action. Sophie's voice, when she found it, carried farther than it should have in the stone-walled space, amplified by magic she didn't understand, but that responded to the truth burning in her heart. "I invoke the right of heart's truth," she said, the formal words feeling strange on her tongue, but somehow exactly right for this moment. I speak for the character of Nikolai Dracul, king of the Northern Covens, and I demand the court's hearing according to the ancient laws that bind us all. The silence that followed her declaration was absolute, as if the very air had been shocked into stillness by the audacity of a mortal claiming rights that hadn't been exercised in over 2 centuries. But Elena's teaching had been thorough, and Sophie pressed forward before doubt could undermine her resolve. Marcus has threatened my innocent brother with death if I don't help him prove Nikolai unfit to rule, she continued, her voice growing stronger as she found her rhythm. He has manipulated me through fear and coercion, using my family as weapons in his political ambitions, and he has violated the core principles of vampire society by targeting mortals who pose no threat to our kind. But more than his crimes, I speak to the truth of Nikolai's strength, which Marcus mistakes for weakness, because he cannot understand that true power lies not in the ability to destroy, but in the wisdom to protect. The words seemed to take on a life of their own as she spoke, resonating through the chamber with supernatural authority that made several court members lean forward in their seats, their ancient faces showing surprise at the weight her testimony carried when spoken in genuine truth and love. For 3 centuries, she continued, growing bolder as she felt the rightness of her cause, Nikolai has maintained peace between vampire factions that would have destroyed each other without his guidance. He has protected human society from the knowledge that would spark warfare between our species, and he has shown mercy to enemies who deserved only death, because he understands that true leadership requires sacrifice rather than selfish ambition. Marcus's face contorted with rage as he realized that Sophie's intervention was shifting the political dynamic in ways he hadn't anticipated, and his careful strategy was unraveling before the assembled court as she spoke truths that resonated with vampires old enough to remember the chaos that preceded Nikolai's reign. "You little human bitch," he snarled, his civilized mask finally slipping to reveal the predatory cruelty that lay beneath his political ambitions. "You dare speak of strength when you know nothing of what it means to rule our kind." Before anyone could react, Marcus lunged towards Sophie with supernatural speed, his blade raised to strike down the mortal who had dared to interfere in vampire justice. But his attack violated every law and tradition that governed the right of heart's truth. Nikolai moved with fluid grace that spoke to centuries of combat experience, his own weapon intercepting Marcus's strike mere inches from Sophie's throat. And when he spoke, his voice carried the absolute authority of a king whose patience had finally reached its end. "By attacking a human speaker exercising her lawful right before this court, you have forfeited any claim to honorable combat," he said, each word ringing through the chamber like a death knell. "Vampire law is clear regarding such violations, and I exercise my right as king to end this farce permanently." What followed was not a duel but an execution, Nikolai's blade finding its target with surgical precision, while Marcus's eyes widened in shock at the realization that his carefully laid plans had been undone by his own inability to control his rage when faced with unexpected opposition. The silence that filled the chamber as Marcus's body dissolved into ash was broken only by the whispered conversations of court members who were already calculating the implications of what they had witnessed and the strength that Sophie's testimony had revealed in their ancient king. Nikolai turned to face the assembled court, his blade still gleaming with traces of his enemy's blood, and when he spoke, his voice carried the quiet confidence of a ruler who had been tested and emerged victorious. "Let it be recorded that the challenge was answered, and the challenger found wanting," he said formally. "And let it also be recorded that the strength of a king is sometimes best measured not by his willingness to destroy, but by his wisdom in choosing what deserves protection." Sophie stood in the center of the ancient circle, her heart hammering against her ribs, as she realized that she had not only saved Nikolai's life, but had fundamentally altered the political landscape of vampire society, by proving that mortal courage and supernatural power could work together rather than in opposition. And as the court began to disperse with grudging acceptance of their king's continued authority, she understood that her life had taken yet another irreversible turn into territory where love and loyalty were the only navigation tools that mattered. The underground chamber fell into profound silence as Marcus's ashes scattered across the ancient stone floor, the remains of his centuries-old ambition reduced to nothing more than dust that would be swept away by the next morning's cleaning, while the assembled vampire court processed the implications of what they had witnessed with the careful deliberation of immortal beings who understood that hasty decisions could echo through eternity. Sophie stood in the center of the dueling circle, still trembling from the adrenaline of her desperate gambit. But as the court members began to rise from their stone seats and approach with expressions that ranged from awe to calculation, she realized that her invocation of the right of heart's truth had accomplished far more than simply saving Nikolai's life in the moment of crisis. Elena appeared at her side with supernatural speed, her face glowing with pride and something that looked like vindication, as she explained in rapid whispers that Sophie's successful invocation had established legal precedent that would ripple through vampire society for generations to come. Never before had a human speaker's testimony carried such weight in formal proceedings, Elena said, her voice barely containing her excitement at the historical significance of what had just occurred. Your words resonated with supernatural authority because they were spoken in perfect truth and genuine love, which according to our oldest laws grants them power equal to any vampire's testimony before the court. The implications are staggering, Sophie, because you've just proven that humans who truly understand and accept our world can participate in our legal and political systems as equals rather than merely protected subjects. Nikolai moved through the dispersing crowd with quiet dignity, accepting formal acknowledgments from court members whose political calculations had shifted dramatically in the wake of Marcus's defeat and Sophie's unprecedented testimony. But his eyes never left her face as he made his way back to her side. When he finally reached her, his expression held wonder and love in equal measure, as if he was seeing her clearly for the first time since they'd met in that ordinary restaurant booth that now seemed like a lifetime ago. The court members who approached them spoke in formal phrases that carried weights of meaning Sophie was only beginning to understand, acknowledging not only Nikolai's reaffirmed authority as king, but also her own newly established status as something unprecedented in vampire society. Lady Sophie, one ancient vampire said with a bow that would have been appropriate for royalty, your courage and wisdom have shown us that the old divisions between our kinds need not be permanent barriers, and your testimony has opened possibilities that we had not dared to imagine in centuries of careful isolation. Another court member, this one from a faction that had previously questioned Nikolai's policies regarding human relations, approached with obvious reluctance that gradually gave way to grudging respect as she spoke. Your defense of His Majesty's character was eloquent and convincing, she admitted, her ancient eyes studying Sophie with new interest. Perhaps there is wisdom in maintaining closer ties with mortals who possess such understanding of our nature and such dedication to justice between our peoples. As the formal ceremonies concluded and the court began to disperse, Nikolai escorted Sophie back to the surface level of Meridians, where the ordinary world waited with all its familiar comforts and concerns. But she found that she could no longer see the restaurant as simply the place where she'd worked to pay for college and support her brother. Every corner held memories of supernatural encounters. Every table had hosted conversations that touched on the hidden workings of the world. And the break room where she'd learned the truth about vampire society now felt like a classroom where she'd received an education that had fundamentally altered her understanding of reality itself. Elena had prepared coffee and sandwiches with motherly efficiency, understanding that Sophie needed normal human comforts after the intensity of the underground proceedings. But even these simple gestures carried new significance in light of what had transpired in the ceremonial chamber. You realize, Elena said gently, as she settled into the chair across from Sophie, that your life can never return to what it was before tonight, don't you? The precedent you've set will bring attention from supernatural communities across the globe, and there will be those who see your influence over vampire law as either opportunity or threat, depending on their political inclinations. Nikolai nodded gravely, his expression showing the weight of centuries of experience in supernatural politics, as he considered the ramifications of Sophie's actions and their potential consequences for both their personal relationship and the broader balance of power between species. More than that, he said quietly, your successful invocation of ancient law has changed something fundamental about your status in our society, Sophie. You're no longer simply a human under royal protection. You're a recognized participant in vampire legal proceedings with rights and responsibilities that carry genuine authority. The old laws are complex, but there are provisions for mortals who prove themselves capable of understanding and navigating our political systems. And tonight, you've demonstrated that capability beyond any possible doubt. Sophie felt the weight of their words settling over her like a mantle she'd never asked to wear. Understanding that her desperate attempt to save Nikolai's life had irrevocably altered not only her own future, but potentially the relationship between human and vampire societies for generations to come. But as she looked at Nikolai's face, seeing the love and gratitude and growing respect in his ancient eyes, she realized that the choice ahead of her wasn't really a choice at all, because her heart had already decided long before her mind caught up to the implications. The offer, when Nikolai finally made it formal, came wrapped in ceremony and tradition that spoke to the gravity of what he was proposing, not just for them personally, but for the entire supernatural world that watched their relationship with fascination and concern. They met in his private chambers above the restaurant, a space that existed in the same dimensional pocket as the dueling chamber, but decorated with comfortable furniture and personal items that revealed glimpses of the man behind the royal title. Ancient books lined shelves that rose to impossible heights, their leather bindings bearing titles in languages that predated human writing systems, while portraits of previous vampire queens and kings watched from gilded frames with eyes that seemed to follow movement through the room. Sophie, Nikolai said, his voice carrying the formal cadences of someone making a declaration that would be recorded in supernatural history. The events of tonight have changed everything about your position in our world and the possibilities for our future together. The right of heart's truth that you invoked successfully has established you as more than simply a protected human. You're now recognized as someone capable of speaking with authority in vampire legal proceedings and participating in supernatural governance as an equal rather than a subject. The implications are staggering, he continued, moving to stand before a window that looked out over the city, where humans and vampires had coexisted in careful ignorance for centuries. Ancient prophecies speak of a time when our kinds would be united under rulers who bridged the gap between mortal and immortal, who possessed understanding of both worlds and loyalty to the welfare of all peoples, rather than the narrow interests of single species. I never dared hope that those prophecies might refer to something real rather than wishful legend, but your actions tonight suggest possibilities I'd abandoned as impossible dreams. The choice he offered was stark in its simplicity, yet overwhelming in its implications. As Sophie realized that she was being asked to decide not just her own future, but the direction of supernatural society for potentially centuries to come. She could remain human under his protection, serving as an advisor and bridge between their worlds, while maintaining her mortal nature and eventually aging and dying while he continued his immortal existence, or she could accept transformation that would grant her vampire abilities, while somehow retaining the human compassion and understanding that had made her valuable as an intermediary between species. The transformation itself would be unlike any previous vampire conversion, Nikolai explained, because her established legal status and demonstrated understanding of supernatural law meant that ancient magic would recognize her not as a new vampire being created, but as an existing authority, being elevated to appropriate physical capabilities. Rather than losing her humanity in the process of gaining immortal strength, she would become something unprecedented, a being who bridged both worlds by embodying the best qualities of each while remaining true to the principles that had earned her supernatural recognition in the first place. Sophie's decision, when it came, surprised no one who had witnessed her courage in defending Nikolai against Marcus's political machinations, because she had already proven that her loyalty transcended personal safety when principles she cared about were at stake. "I choose transformation," she said simply, her voice steady despite the magnitude of what she was accepting. "Not for power or immortality or the status that comes with being queen, but because I want to stand beside you as an equal partner in building the kind of future where both our peoples can thrive without fear or secrecy." The ritual took place at dawn, as the first light of morning painted the sky in shades of gold and rose that seemed to symbolize the bridging of day and night, mortality and immortality, human hope and vampire wisdom that Sophie's transformation represented. Nikolai had arranged for witnesses from both supernatural and mortal communities, understanding that this moment needed to be properly recorded and remembered as the beginning of a new era in species relations. Danny stood near the front of the assembled crowd, his face showing the kind of protective concern that only siblings could generate, but also growing acceptance as Elena had spent hours explaining the significance of what his sister was choosing and the safeguards that would protect her through the transformation process. The ritual itself was beautiful and terrifying in equal measure, ancient words of binding and transformation mixing with newer vows of partnership and shared responsibility as Sophie felt Nikolai's blood entering her system and her own mortality slowly giving way to something larger and more complex. But rather than losing her human nature in the process, she found that her mortal experiences and emotions seemed to grow stronger and more nuanced, as if the vampire magic was enhancing rather than replacing the qualities that had made her valuable as a bridge between worlds. Visions flooded her consciousness as the transformation progressed, centuries of Nikolai's loneliness and responsibility, his endless vigil over vampire society, and his growing hope that someday, the careful balance between hidden supernatural communities and oblivious human civilization might evolve into something more honest and sustainable. She saw his memories of Catherine, Maria, and Sarah, the previous human women who had earned his affection and died for it, and she understood that her survival and elevation represented not just personal victory, but the fulfillment of dreams that had sustained him through centuries of isolation and loss. When the transformation was complete, and Sophie opened her eyes to look out over the assembled witnesses with vision that could perceive details invisible to mortal sight, she felt the weight of genuine authority settling over her shoulders like a crown made of responsibility rather than precious metals. But more than that, she felt the continuing presence of her human compassion and understanding, the qualities that had made her valuable as an intermediary between species, now enhanced and strengthened rather than diminished by her new supernatural capabilities. Danny was the first to approach, his face showing wonder and relief in equal measure, as he realized that his sister was still fundamentally herself, despite the magnitude of her transformation. And when he hugged her, she was careful to control her new strength while marveling at the fact that she could now hear his heartbeat and smell the unique scent that marked him as family. Elena followed with tears of joy streaming down her face, explaining that Sophie's successful transformation had proven theories about the compatibility of human and vampire natures that had been debated for centuries without resolution. Nikolai's expression held wonder and love, and something that looked like peace for the first time since Sophie had known him. As if a burden he'd carried for centuries had finally been lifted from his shoulders, by the knowledge that he would no longer have to rule alone or watch the person he loved age and die while he remained unchanged. The ceremony concluded with formal recognition of Sophie's new status, not just as Nikolai's queen, but as co-ruler of the Northern Covens and official ambassador between vampire and human societies. positions that carried both tremendous authority and equally tremendous responsibility for managing the careful revelation of supernatural society to a mortal world that was finally ready to accept the truth about the creatures that had lived among them in secrecy for so long. Meridian's restaurant was formally designated as the first official embassy between human and vampire societies, a neutral ground where representatives of both species could meet and negotiate without the usual fears and prejudices that had kept them separated for centuries. And Danny was offered a position as Sophie's human advisor, helping to ensure that mortal perspectives were properly represented in supernatural governance. 6 months later, as Sophie stood in the same dining room where her ordinary life had ended and her extraordinary new existence had begun, wearing a crown of silver and moonstone that marked her unique status as a bridge between worlds, she watched human diplomats and vampire nobility sharing meals and conversations that would have been impossible just a year before. Booth 7 remained her favorite spot for private conversations with Nikolai, where the vampire king still sometimes appeared as a frail old man in need of kindness, and she still offered it freely because some things, the best things about human nature, never needed to change, even when everything else about her world had been transformed beyond recognition. And as she looked out over a room filled with beings who had once lived in fear of each other, now working together to build a better future for all their peoples, Sophie understood that her choice to defend a lonely stranger had led to consequences more wonderful and far-reaching than she could ever have imagined in her wildest dreams.